Is 4K gaming actually dumb? And full disclosure, I don't play my PC games in 4K. I play mine in 1440p, we'll talk about why here in a second, but I wanted to make this video in direct response to one of Linus' tech tips that was uploaded back in November of 2018. It received a lot of mixed feedback, due in large part to its conclusion that 4K gaming was in fact dumb. I mean, the title kind of says it all. So here's our own testing and our own response. Privacy.com is the easy way to shop securely online by creating virtual debit cards tied securely to your bank account. You can even download the browser extension and let it autofill card information with a single click. Get started for free and earn a $5 credit by clicking the link below today. So does 4K gaming make sense? Linus starts out by mentioning the level of detail a human eye can discern, and that's roughly 1/60th of an arc second, at least that's the general consensus, and there's an equation for this. Just plug and chug a bunch of simple variables and boom, out comes your result. So the closest you could sit in theory to a 24-inch 1080p panel without seeing individual pixels is about 3 feet or 91 centimeters. You can test this yourself. That metric's pretty spot on for me. I've linked the website down below, by the way, in case you want to play around with it a bit. Now let's bump the resolution to 4K and keep screen size the same. By the way, 4K is 3840 by 2160 in this case. The closest you can now sit is roughly 1.4 feet. Again, pretty spot on for me. But there's a problem with these figures. You see, they don't take into account other perceived aspects of a quality image, things like sharpness and contrast, and they do play a huge role. So at this point, Linus jumps into anti-aliasing.
This technology takes neighboring pixels and kind of blends them together, and it can make a display seem like it's higher resolution than it actually is.
We've got a dedicated video on what that is and how it works right here, but in a nutshell, AA works by blurring edges and smoothing out rough and angled or curved surfaces depicted by square pixels. Check out these side-by-sides of the GTA benchmark in 1080p. The left has absolutely no AA at all. The right has AA maxed out at ×8. Both runs are locked to 60 Hz, by the way. See a difference? So AA really matters when pixels are noticeable, and in theory, if we had an infinite number of them packed into a display, AA would be redundant since all images would appear perfectly shaped. The problem is we use square pixels, and when those pixels are perceived as very large chunks of light, that's when you start noticing rough edges.
To test this, we grabbed 3 gaming monitors with the major 16:9 resolutions, and with each of them locked to 60 Hz with anti-aliasing turned on in our games, we want to see if our test subjects can tell the difference.
Linus's argument is that anti-aliasing makes a big enough difference in games to justify a lower resolution, and proves this by sampling the opinions of 3 other members of his team. They could, for the most part, discern the 4K panel from the lower res counterparts, even from 3 or so feet away, which technically violates the equation we referenced earlier, and that's because perceived sharpness is still a thing. But Linus at this point shifts the argument entirely to refresh rate, stating that all 3 panels were around $500 and that the 1080p and 1440p units pack 240 and 144 Hz refresh rates, respectively.
And I've been a long-time believer that refresh rate makes a way bigger difference to the gaming experience than resolution. So we're gonna get Doom running on all 3 of these and see what people prefer to play on in a fast-paced shooter.
So it was sort of a bait and switch here. The basis of his argument was that the 1/60th of an arc second metric he mentioned at the beginning of the video is kind of out the door. We're talking about refresh rates and not resolution. Those two have nothing really to do with each other, although they are nice to have both in the same package. And I think that that was Linus' intention all along. I think we can agree that people have different levels of acceptable visual clarity, and just because some equation says things have to be a certain way, that doesn't actually mean they work out that way in real life. Ask anyone who's used a 4K panel, that they'll tell you that going back down to a 1080p panel is no bueno. I mean, even if that person sits 3 feet away, at which point you technically couldn't even tell the difference between 1080p and 1440p, that same person will notice when the panel's resolution changes, especially when the image displayed is static. But Linus is right about gaming. The fast-paced nature of most scenes is enough to draw the human eye more to the smoothness aspect rather than the resolution. That was the point of his video after all, was 4K and gaming, whether or not those two were viable. Now, refresh rates above 60 Hz are not possible to depict via YouTube. I could in theory slow down clips to the point where a 240 FPS clip still looks great at 60 FPS compared to 15 FPS at 25% playback speed, but this would be an unrealistic comparison, so this isn't an argument I can really defend on this channel, though high refresh rate gamers already know exactly what I'm talking about. So instead, I'll stick with the visual argument and try to defend it as best I can. So here's what I did. I stuck with GTA 5 to keep things consistent and ran two different passes. First up was 4K, medium settings for the most part, no anti-aliasing, no advanced graphics. It's what you're seeing here. Things look pretty great, but the in-game detail had to be dropped in order to maintain an acceptable frame rate. By the way, the computer running these tests is sporting an RTX 2070 and a Core i9-9900K, so it's definitely no lightweight. My second test, however, was run in 1440p. At this point, I could turn on just a bit of AA and bump remaining settings across the board. In-game detail was definitely improved across the board, but again, at a lower resolution overall. Side by side, you've got more pixels to the right and thus more visual detail, ignoring the fact that this entire video was exported in 4K, but you've got more in-game detail to the left. So my thinking in this is, why bump your gaming resolution to 4K if all you're going to be doing in the long run is either A, significantly lowering your in-game frame rate, or B, lowering in-game settings to compensate, at which point, why increase resolution at all if all you're going to be doing is adding more detail to a game that suddenly looks crappier. Now keep in mind that if you're viewing this video in a resolution much lower than 1080p, let's say 360p, you probably can't play along here. But if you're viewing this in especially 4K, I'd now like you to pick the side of the screen that was running the benchmark natively in 4K. Can you tell which is which? Even if your screen only supports 1080p, bump the video to 4K just for this test to remove any issues with image quality and bitrate. Can you tell a difference? This is the 4K screenshot, and this is the 1440p screenshot. Different angle here. Actually, all in-game settings are identical. Everything's maxed out across the board except anti-aliasing. On the 4K side, no AA is on, but on the 1440p side, 4x anti-aliasing is on. So back to Linus's point, anti-aliasing does make a noticeable difference even in-game. It doesn't make up for it entirely, but it definitely narrows the gap almost enough to the point where a 4K panel that's presumably locked to 60 Hz is a bit, to use his word, dumb. Now I'd like to close with a bit of talk into just how taxing 4K can be on your hardware. Using a PPI or pixel per inch calculator, we can determine just how many pixels fit into an inch of screen real estate. So if our 4K panel is 27 diagonal inches and in the 16:9 aspect, then the screen has a PPI of 163. But in all honesty, I mean, that means nothing unless we compare it with other resolutions. So let's do 1080p. Now our PPI has dropped to 81.5, and that makes sense. 4K is literally 4 1080p panels stacked around each other. And by the way, for the sticklers out there, we're talking about 3840 by 2160 again when we reference 4K, not cinematic 4K at 4096 pixels across. Just thought I'd clear that up because there are always a few wise guys in the comments ready to ruin everything. So when we double the horizontal pixel count and condense it into the same space, PPI doubles. That makes sense, right? But even 1440p is a large step down from 4K. If you zoomed in on individual pixels, this is what 1440p would look like, and this is what 4K would look like. Two very different pixel densities and two very different loads for your graphics card to process. 4K definitely looks great in person, but when gaming, I'd take the higher refresh rate any day of the week and still bump in-game settings for a better overall experience. Subjective, yeah, to an extent, but no one can deny the fact that in order to maintain the same frame rate, you have to lower in-game settings when stepping up to 4K. Why add more pixels to an image that suddenly looks worse? I mean, you could probably make the argument if you were running like a Ryzen 3 1200 with an RTX 2080 Ti. Maybe at that point, bumping the resolution would actually give you a better frame rate. I'm not too sure, haven't tested that, but in most cases, if you have a balanced or semi-balanced system, anytime you up the resolution, right, from 1080p to 1440p or from 1440p to 4K, your frame rate will drop as a result.
And the problem is that you can't have both. Every display interface has a limit to how many pixels it can push per second, which is why up until very recently, every 4K monitor has been capped at 60 Hz, making for an inferior gaming experience, outside of some edge cases.
So in my view, it doesn't make sense to add more pixels to an image that suddenly looks worse, assuming you're gonna drop in-game settings. When it gets to the point that you really need to sacrifice in-game detail for the sake of resolution, I think you've gone too far. Case in point, here's a 4K screenshot with medium tessellation, right? Medium settings, it's okay. Here's the same screenshot though, in 1440p with tessellation now set to high. It just seems a bit ironic and counterintuitive to increase screen detail only to see worse quality in-game. A bit like adding more gross food to your plate at a buffet? Wouldn't you rather cut back a bit and enjoy something tasty? That's 1440p gaming for me. I may not have the same screen detail as a 4K gamer, but I can still enjoy higher in-game detail and a higher refresh rate for a more balanced workload. What do you think? Let me know what resolution refresh rate you game in, and be sure to recommend future topics as well in the comment section below. You guys can leave this video a thumbs up if you thought it was cool, dislike for the complete opposite feeling, or if you hate everything about life, click that red subscribe button if you haven't already. You can become a member if you want to be fancy with it. Stay tuned for the next video. This is Science Studio. Thanks for learning with us.